seminar regarding medical device regulation and digital health problems and perspective that the Leader Lab of the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies, as partner of the SoBigData++ consortium, organizes. Now, the seminar is actually the second part of the first seminar in which we already had the possibility to talk about the challenges arising from the medical device regulation. And there we immediately felt that the medical device regulation is just a small regulatory fragment of a much broader landscape regarding digital health. So today's seminar will try to inquire a bit more in depth all the problematic aspects regarding the regulation of digital health, starting but also moving beyond the medical device regulation. So I thank Professor Giovanni Comandè and Denise Amram and Andrea Parziale of the Leader Lab who have supported the organization of this seminar, and I am particularly grateful for our invited speakers, Paul Quinn of Freie Universität of Brussels and Alessandro Blasimme of ETH for participating to this seminar. So in order not to take too much time, I will immediately give the floor to our first speaker, Paul Quinn, who will talk to us about the first problems related to digital health. Please, Professor.
Hello, thank you, Giulia. Yes, I'm going to share my screen. Before I continue, first of all, thank you for inviting me. And secondly, perhaps more importantly, please let me know if there are problems, because I have bandwidth problems the last few days. So I'm going to switch my screen off to help this. And also, please let me know if it freezes or you don't hear from me. Thank you. Okay, I'm presuming you see my screen. Someone please let me know if there's a problem. Okay. What am I going to talk about? First of all, as you saw from my title, I'm working on areas of enhancement now. Presently, I have in the first year of teaching a course on the legal issues of human enhancement at the VUB. My background, I worked a lot on the use of health data. I've also in the past been interested in the medical device regulation, and in particular the regulation of well-being devices. I wrote a paper on apps a few years ago, and I'm quite interested in basically what this presentation is about is comparing enhancement as a concept to something like well-being, because well-being showed up some of the problems with the medical device framework, and I want to show that enhancement does too, and it gives us a slightly different perspective. I'm going to talk about the difficulty in defining which is a major issue if anybody looks into the literature on this, and that it could entail a wide range of different devices, that not all of engaged by the medical device framework, and that results in a application. Okay, so what is enhancement? It is notoriously difficult to define. You can read many different works on this in the past decades, and especially if we're looking for a general global definition, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find something. It's very difficult to separate medical acts and acts of augmentation or enhancement. Sometimes there is an overlap, and it's very difficult to know what the difference is. One of the typical, almost basic ways of defining what augmentation or enhancement is the concept of beyond species normal. That is different than medical treatment. Medical treatment is bringing somebody back to normal, whereas enhancement entails going beyond it. However, if you look into this in more depth, if you look into it with real contexts and examples, there are enormous problems with this manner of defining. What is normal? Should we define it objectively or subjectively? For example, what should something be considered an enhancement because the individual thinks it benefits them? For example, there are many bizarre forms of individual desires Perhaps the most extreme is something called lymphic dysmorphia, where people want to remove parts of their body. Of course, an individual consider that an enhancement, but most people wouldn't. And so there is a very difficult thing in defining what enhancement is. This makes it difficult to discern, for example, what is the difference between enhancement and just alteration. For example, what is the difference between various forms of cosmetic surgery and human enhancement? Yes, it's very difficult. And the application of the medical device law is important. Medical device law is an important legal framework, and it has an important role, as we all know, in regulating devices that work in or on the body. And it foresees a stricter regulation for certain risky or implantable devices. Importantly, medical device regulation applies in addition to normal consumer protection, product liability frameworks, and it also foresees forms of ex ante regulation, i.e. regulation that applies before products are placed in the market. So in this way, it provides safety to the users of augmentation and enhancement products, and it's likely to be relevant to issues of augmentation and enhancement, like well-being, because it's time to separate what is enhancement and what is medical treatment. Just as with the case of well-being, it was difficult to separate what is the difference between medical treatment and well-being. And importantly, beyond just the simple definition of what is for medical purposes, as I will talk about, there are some important exceptions in both the EU and the US framework. The medical device framework sometimes applies to devices even where it is accepted that they are not for medical purposes. And this is important because it may apply to a number of risky or controversial enhancement contexts. Comparisons to well-being. Well, well-being is similar but different. There is some overlap. In general, well-being does not necessarily entail improvement upon the human condition, but rather meeting the extent the human condition allows, allowing the body to function as it should. Whereas enhancement, general understanding is that it entails going beyond what is considered normal functioning for humans. And there is, I would say, you could take debate with this point, but there is a more objective consensus on what constitutes well-being compared to what constitutes enhancement, especially when you take into account some bizarre forms of intervention that might be considered enhancement to a particular individual, but most certainly would not by the majority of people. And another important factor is, arguably, if you look at the context and the examples of proposed enhancement devices and activities, and you compare them with well-being activities, I would say that the former could be described as containing devices that are more riskier in nature. And yeah, I've got some videos here. I'm not going to show them because of time constraints. But yeah, this is just emphasizing the problem with the very broad definition of enhancement, starting off with simple, rather safe devices that are not very controversial. Things such as T-shirts that let you see how your body is working. For example, this example is color-coded. It changes according to your sweat and other information. And then going up to things that are a bit more risky, a bit more controversial, you have concepts of enhancement that foresee the implantation of devices. For example, this is not even new anymore, but people implant RFID into themselves to allow them to do certain things, open doors, uses a form, that sort of thing. And the is often not to actually change anything that the body does biochemically or structurally itself, but to give the person a new functionality. Other examples, magnets. Some people have implanted magnets into themselves. They say it gives them a sixth sense because they can feel when there is magnetic influences around them. Again, the aim of this type of activity is not to change the functioning of the body per se, but to give it a new functionality. But importantly, there is surgical activity, you could say. Things are implanted into the body. And then, what is and that goes further, it goes very far to, we saw Elon Musk speaking recently about the possibility for brain implants, and things, he predicted things would start off calmly. This would let you read information about your brain, but eventually he proposed that this could go further to activities that would allow you to influence the functioning of your brain. And these effectively are fully implantable devices that would be implanted in the brain, and all that present risks and challenges and raises serious questions about the legal framework that applies to it. So it's very important to determine which frameworks apply, regulatory burdens apply, and here we're particularly concerned with the question, are these just normal consumer products or are they medical devices? Because there is regulatory burden, as we all know, and some medical devices require considerable expertise to comply with. Getting the CE mark, on the classification of the device entails a lot of knowledge. It's not something the average person knows how to do. And so it requires expertise. This adds to the burden of anyone who wants to develop one of these devices. And basically, if it's a medical device, you have to get certification on the market. The main elements, if it's a medical device, are a range of important essential requirements that must be complied with, a process for certification, the role of various bodies, and importantly, with the medical device regulation now, there is an increased role for post-market surveillance. This doesn't apply where something is not classed as a medical device. So this is important in the context of augmentation, given that we're talking about a wide range of devices that could entail quite a risk for those who are using them. The consequences of MDR application, it's slower to develop devices, you need more expertise, staffing, cost, and there are limitations. And of course, one would hope there is better safety for those who use them. And the question is, does it apply, the medical device regulation apply to augmentation? There are difficulties for the reasons I spoke of, the difficulty of defining, should we questions of stifling investment. These are similar questions that were raised in the context of the well-being debate also. And are we talking about vulnerable users? Are we talking about well-informed users? Do we have to worry about paternalism? Well, I would submit the answer is that we're talking about a wide variety of different people. Simple answer, primarily because of the wide range of potential augmentation devices. In general, the MDR, the regulation only applied to medical devices, as we all know, and these were defined in Article 2 of the directive. And there was a controversy, especially when the well-being of medical apps began to arise, because it relied heavily on the concept of intended purposes. This was defined as such, and it essentially was concerning because it allowed manufacturers to place things on the market that they claimed were not medical devices, which arguably were, because they could perform similar functions. And another problem was the actual definition of active, and there was a lot of debate about whether devices of a kind of medical device character, but which didn't have an intended purpose of a medical device, could be called medical devices. Interestingly, if you look at these different categories, this did exist, and it is one of the only ones that doesn't seem to invoke the notion of, but the general consensus backed up by various policy documents and advices was that the directive did not apply in general to non-intended medical devices, such as well-being apps, and also probably enhancement devices. Now, if we look at the regulation, this is an addition that has changed things somewhat. I would argue that it's made it more clear that in general terms, this is the definition in the regulation of a medical device. In general terms, it's not intended to apply to medical devices. So in this way, it is a clarification. the uncertainty is less. The medical regulation does not per se apply to non-medical devices, including well-being and augmentation devices. However, the drafters are obviously aware of the debate about these kind of analogous devices, and they made room for it with the creation of Annex 16. Annex 16 is a group of essentially exceptions to the general rule, which basically stipulate a group of other categories of devices which, although don't have an intended purpose, are seen to possess such a risk that they will require regulation as a medical device. If we look at them, we have these kind of brain stimulation devices, obvious risks because they can effectively alter the way the brain works, electromagnetic radiation, and we have issues such as cosmetic therapy. And then an important general one here, products intended to be totally or partially introduced to the human body through surgically invasive means. And this is very important because this will capture a lot of medical augmentation devices, and in particularly those that don't intend to do something medical, but they may result in the alteration of human tissue. And especially think of, for example, the brain, given its plastic nature, it could potentially catch a large range of devices. So this is a welcome alteration of the medical device framework to take into account devices of an analogous character. So there is somewhat less ambiguity. The scope of application is now clear. I mean, the general rule. With regards to the exceptions, the medical device regulation allows them to be increased. So there is room for maneuver here in the future. And this is important because we are in a state of full-on evolution, and we don't know what the state of play will be soon. And arguably, this moves Europe in the same direction as the US. Here there is there is a wide-ranging provision here that allows seemingly a lot of augmentation-style devices to be caught. This idea of altering the structure or function of the human body is very important because it essentially relates to not only implantable things, which obviously result in some alteration, but also things that work on radiation on the brain that influence the brain, which is very important. And because the brain is such a plastic organ, it could, in theory, encapsulate a wide range of enhancement devices, because a lot of things that have a long-term effect on the brain will effectively alter it in some way. And it's interesting, one interesting debate is which is wider, the EU or the US definition. I would say perhaps the US, but I mean, it's open to neither capture everything. But this idea of anything that alters a structure or a function is perhaps greater than the wording in the medical device regulation. But yeah, that's open to debate. And of course, in the US, you have the wellness exemptions. Some of this, because of the overlapping nature, will apply. They have a document that says that it will not apply to wellness devices of a low risk. And in this regard, the FDA has taken a more active role in excluding low-risk wellness devices. Some will be likely to, as I said, fall into the category of augmentation and enhancement. However, it excludes higher-risk wellness devices which may also relate to augmentation. So wellness is not the only non-treatment paradigm we should be looking at. I think it's important to have a flexible way of looking at things going forward, especially because I mean, enhancement, the possibilities for it are growing all the time. Where 10 years ago the concern was with wellness, I think moving towards a world where we have to think, in a bigger way, because there will be more medical style interventions that are not maybe classed as medical interventions, and we have to be concerned about them going forward, particularly the range of implantable type enhancement devices is going to expand quite dramatically. And it's like, as a result of the changes in definition, the MDR is more likely to apply to a range of enhancement devices than it did before, in particular devices which are implanted in the body or have an effect on the brain. And it's arguable that it will therefore catch many high risk forms of enhancement, though we don't have time to do this now. If you the categories in the annex, there are exceptions that are concerning, and if you look at the context of devices, these are evolving all the time. So there is a clear need for vigilance going forward. But that one good thing is that the annex can be changed, of course. There's still ambiguity about what constitutes altering the structure of the body. In particular, with regard to the human brain, this is quite an important area, because the brain is a uniquely complex machine, and it's, by its very nature, alters itself according to the environment it is placed in. And many less risky augmentation devices will not be caught by the MDR and will not be subject to MDR regulation, though they will, of course, be subject to product liability regulation. Again, I think vigilance is needed going forward, because although the type of devices that are not caught, for example, devices that are outside the body and which do not alter the structure of the body, that may be okay now. It's possible that in the future, with changing technological possibilities, that there may appear that may not be caught, but which may pose a great risk. And it's important to think of this going forward. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul Quinn, for these thoughts. We'll jump immediately on some of the things you have said in order to, I hope you see now my screen. Perfect. In order to make some reflections regarding the problems of the definition of standards and certifications in the realms of artificial intelligence driven digital health devices. And indeed, as Professor Paul Quinn very well expressed, medical devices are just the tip of the iceberg, of a much broader iceberg of digital health application devices and services, which just fall outside the scope of the medical device regulation, which, as Professor Paul Quinn has explained before, is restricted to this intended medical purpose requirement, which not all digital health application devices and services, of course, fulfill. And this creates a very fragmented and dishomogeneous regulatory landscape that we can picture here in this sort of pyramid, where more general regulatory requirements are needed to be found in the Data Protection Framework, Cybersecurity Act, the proposed Data Governance Act, and this sort of diverse regulatory frameworks gives rise to much uncertainties regarding applicable standards regarding artificial intelligence driven digital health devices. And this situation of uncertainty is also aggravated by the fact that all these regulations are quite new regulations, are quite recent regulations, and all the certification mechanisms envisaged under these respective frameworks are currently under draft. And so this attributes and even greater uncertainties regarding applicable standards. But what are we talking about when we talk about standards and certification for artificial intelligence-driven digital health application? Now, standards very generally relate to the design of these devices. And this is part from a qualitative, a structural, and an organizational standpoint. is very much important if we think about the very important role of all these digital health applications, not only for the purposes of the provision of care and in the medical practice, but also as a very fundamental source of health data, which are further used for research purposes. So in this learning digital health system, of course, the design of these applications pretty much reflects itself further onto the design of the digital health research ecosystem. And so it is very much crucial of defining relevant standards, in particularly in relation to the inclusivity, that is the acceptabilities of these devices, the interoperability of these devices, in order to promote the sharing and the pooling of this health information, and the sustainability of these devices. This meaning that innovation, of course, must be designed also in order and in conformity with the respect of the fundamental rights also involved in the use and in the employment of these devices. And certification are a transparency means, an accountability means of economic operation in order to signal to the market that specific standards are fulfilled. And so standards and certification and the definition of the relevant framework of standards in the realm of digital health is crucial exactly for building the trust, which is the main objective of the European Commission in the development of the emerging European health data space. But of course, this framework regarding the applicable standards in this realm is, as I was telling at the beginning, very much at the beginning of its development. In the medical device framework, and as we will see in a moment, provides only a piece of the bigger picture, starting from the more general applicable framework, which are exactly applicable to all the digital health devices. We can start from the General Data Protection Regulation, which, as you know, provides general principles such as the principle of quality, integrity, accurateness of health data sets, which is absolute of paramount importance in order to prevent the development of algorithmic biases in these systems. But it provides only a very general framework. And the European Commission, which has a few days ago just released a report over the applicable rules regarding health data under the GDPR in member states, actually has highlighted the importance of the development of further standards regarding quality, regarding the acceptability of health data, which is employed in particular for research purposes, through the development of appropriate codes of conduct. Now, codes of conduct have been called upon since quite many years from the entering into force of the GDPR, but today is no general code of conduct regarding the use of health data in the realm of digital health has been issued, and the Commission itself has sort of observed how the drafting of such code would employ much time still, which does not contribute to the creation of a certain framework in a brief time frame. And also the certification mechanisms which have been envisaged under Article 42 of the General Data Protection just starting to be drafted by the national data protection authorities, and the European Data Protection Board has very recently issued opinions on drafts which the data protection authorities have submitted to the European Data Protection Board regarding envisaged certification mechanisms. So all this system is starting to be developed, but we are in a very early stage yet. But what is interesting to highlight is that under the framework for research, which is envisaged under the data protection, as you may know, under Article 89 of the General Data Protection Regulation, data controllers are required to implement appropriate safeguards. And we can say that within this general clause of appropriate safeguards, also standards and certifications regulation under other applicable frameworks are to be applied. And here comes the distinction between medical devices and digital health devices or application, which fall outside the scope of the medical device frameworks. And if we go into the medical device framework here, the medical device regulation actually interestingly sets some standards regarding the inclusivity of the employed data sets. For example, manufacturers are required to release information regarding selection criteria, size of investigation population, the representativeness of population. It starts also to the basic framework regarding the interoperability for medical devices. Indeed, the regulation gives account to the existing or sort of underlies the existence of so-called borderline products, that is medical devices, which are also related to pharmaceutical products. And in this respect, it encourages stronger collaboration between competent bodies under the medical device frameworks and the European Medicines Agency. And of course, it sets also some important cybersecurity standards, which is also, however, a very early framework again, and the Medical Device Regulation Forum has set exactly the definition of clearer standards as a paramount priority within 2025. Now, the problem also, for example, with cybersecurity standards is, as Professor Quinn was mentioning again, reference and the relation of these standards always to this intended use of the product. And of course, in the digital health sector, the same device can serve many different purposes, and this creates in turn uncertainty in respect also to the applicable standards. When the medical device regulation talks about the repeatability, the reliability and performance of the device in line with the intended use, what is exactly the intended use must of course be clarified, and this may create some problems also when it comes, for example, in the implementation of measures against unauthorized access, which are necessary to run the software as intended. But what has the manufacturer intended? This, of course, is a problem that will need to be further specified. The Cybersecurity Act, outside the scope of the medical device regulation, the Cybersecurity Act also provides some standards, cybersecurity standards and certification mechanisms. It envisages indeed a European cybersecurity certification framework, and electronic medical devices are identified as a key area in which this certification framework shall develop more specific certification mechanisms. It is up to the Commission the identification of the priority that the European Cybersecurity Agency shall follow, taking as the benchmark the parameters of security by design, privacy by design, organizational measures, technical measures, which will have to be specified and further implemented within the more specific realm of digital health devices. Now, in respect to cybersecurity, there are already existing standards under the for example, ISO standards on health informatics. There is a NETSI project on e-health which sets some standard, but the European Cybersecurity Agency has underlined the need of identifying, in light of this very diversified environment, the European Cybersecurity Agency has stressed the need of identification of more specific area of certifiability in the field exactly of health informatics. Now, a very last point before concluding is that Of course, when we talk about digital health informatics, about digital health application devices, the clinical trials framework, which sets standards, specific quality and safety standards for medicinal products, is also in many cases of difficult application. And it is interesting to state that the joint big data task force of the European Medicines Agency has exactly underlined the need of the definition of clearer regulatory standards for these real-world data which are employed in research, in particular regarding the diversity, inclusiveness and quality control measures regarding exactly the data, the health data that are employed in research. And this definition of standards is then the prerequisite of also the tailoring of a specific certification model regarding these health data. And maybe under the European Data Innovation Board that is envisaged under the proposed Data Governance Acts may provide clearer responses in this direction. Indeed, the European Data Innovation Board is competent, amongst other, exactly also for the certification and for the drafting of certification and authorization schemes. And it is interesting to recall that this board shall comprise, amongst other, also representatives of data spaces, and this means representatives of the envisaged European health data space, and also members of competent authorities in specific sectors. This means exactly also potentially representative of the European Medicines Agency or the competent authorities under the medical device regulation. Further clarification are of course expected under the European Health Data Space, the envisaged European Health Data Space legislation, which, as the European Commission has announced, is exactly sort of expected to draft more clearer rules regarding responsible use of health data and setting more precise governance principles. This could be done, for example, this is just a preliminary thought, through the setting of a standardized database regarding non-clinical data, that what the European Medicines Agency defines as a real-world data, and the definition of more appropriate governance structure supervising the construction and deployment of predictive models well beyond the medical device framework. I think that only through this the needed legal certainty would be achieved, and with that also the trust in this emerging European health data space, which of course will come to govern also the area of digital health related devices. Thank you very much. Okay, and with that, I will immediately give the floor to Andrea Parziale, which will move on to the consideration of liability aspects of digital health. I think I'll stop sharing my screen. Okay, perfect.
Okay, thank you, Giulia. I don't know if you can see my presentation now.
Yes, Andrea, it's fine.
Okay, great. So, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank all the organizers of this fascinating webinar, in which I will build on the previous presentations and had the pleasure to give a presentation about the impact, as anticipated, about the impact of digital health and artificial intelligence on EU medical device product liability. So let's first recap very quickly the main characteristics of EU products liability law under the Directive of 1985, which outlines a no-fault liability regime under which manufacturers are liable for damages caused by the defective products they put into circulation. Manufacturers can also avoid liability through a series of different defenses, including the development risk defense, which basically means that the manufacturer is not liable for damages caused by a defect that could not be identified when the product was put into circulation. So this liability regime presupposes a rather traditional business model focusing on tangible products placed on the market by one-time action, after which the manufacturer loses control over them. All in all, this liability regime plainly applies to traditional medical devices, and actually, medical device product liability cases already had an impact on EU product liability law in general. In particular, in the Boston Scientific Judgment of 2015, as you may remember, which concerned defective pacemakers, the Court of Justice of the European Union stated that if products belonging to a given production line have a potential defect, then an individual product belonging to said production line can be considered as defective without the need for proving that the individual product actually has such a defect. And this really helps claimants under product liability law. However, my first point in this presentation is that basic assumptions underlying the EU Product Liability Directive are being significantly challenged by important developments occurring in the medical device market nowadays, especially with the rise of digital health, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Medical Things. So to better understand this, I think it's useful, it may be useful to provide a basic taxonomy of such innovations based on two main criteria. Former criterion is about the relationship between software and physical device. And from this point of view, software can be either integrated into a physical device or standalone. For instance, in the case of mobile health and lifestyle apps. In contrast, the latter criterion is about the degree of autonomy enjoyed by a digital health system, with a distinction to be drawn between programmed and autonomous systems, such as clinical robot assistants, which have self-learning capabilities. In contrast, programmed systems are, let's say, completely predetermined by programmers and much less, if no autonomy at all. So let's see how all these innovations impact, challenge the basic assumptions of EU product liability law. First challenge here is with the notion of product under the Product Liability Directive, which only refers, as we all know, to tangible products, products we can touch. So software developers are not subject to no-fault liability, while manufacturers of physical devices or physical components remain the primary target of liability claims. And this does not really reflect the emerging business models for medical devices, in which software plays an increasingly important role compared to physical components. And this may lead to inefficient allocations of liability risks and costs. Then we have a second challenge, which concerns product defectiveness and causation, because digital health solutions may be extremely complex from a technical point of view, and even autonomous through self-learning techniques, deep learning techniques, and so on. And this could make it really hard for victims to identify and prove product defectiveness and causation. Finally, a third challenge, which basically regards the development risk defense, which may let manufacturers avoid liability systematically in digital solutions, especially when it comes to autonomous artificial intelligence systems, where the defect may arise from the self-learning capabilities of such systems after the product is put into circulation. So my second point in this presentation is that the proposals developed by the report on liability for artificial intelligence of 2019 may help tackle these challenges, also in the context of digital health and AI in medical devices. In particular, I agree that software developers should be subject to product liability to better reflect the emerging medical device business models where software is more and more important. Then I also agree with the proposal to require manufacturers to install means of recording information. This is referred to in this report with the expression login by design, which may help victims establish product defectiveness and causation. I also agree with the proposals to alleviate generally the burden of proof of defect and causation in favor of victims in cases of stark information asymmetries. Finally, I agree that the development risk defense should not apply when the producer retains some degree of control over the product after the product is put into circulation, for instance, through updates and upgrades. So overall, these proposals would require a formal amendment to the Product Liability Directive, for instance, including software in the notion of product surely requires an amendment to the directive because the directive defines product as any tangible good, even though the MDR, the Medical Device Regulation, clarifies that software may be a medical product. However, I also think that we can argue that the Medical Device Regulation contains certain provisions that could be used to somehow implement some of these proposals, the proposal we talked about earlier, without the need for a formal amendment to the Product Liability Directive. What I mean by this, for instance, there's this very interesting provision in the MDR, it's Article 10, Paragraph 14, which enables injured persons to get access to the information on medical devices directly from manufacturers through the filter, through the mediation of national competent authorities. In Italy, it would be the Ministry of Health. And I think this may help victims gather data, information to establish product effectiveness, causation, and even manufacturer fault in fault-based liability claims. I feel this is in line with the proposals to alleviate information asymmetries between manufacturers and patients. At the same time, to be honest, this tool lacks some teeth because it is specified that injured persons do not really have a right of access if the information they request is quote unquote ordinarily dealt with in legal proceedings. This wording is actually unclear, so it is still to be seen how this tool will be used in practice, actually. However, I think that this provision has the potential of helping victims in complex cases, especially those involving digital and AI-powered medical devices. Finally, medical device regulation does not impact directly the development risk defense, but may reduce its scope of application in practice. Why do I say so? Because the MDR significantly clarifies and strengthens the post-marketing monitoring obligations of manufacturers, and this may help victims establish forms of fault-based liability of manufacturers for failure to fulfill these monitoring obligations. And this may somehow help claimants circumvent, in a way, the barrier represented by the development risk defense, which may be crucial in cases involving defective digital and AI-powered medical devices. So now I think we can get back to the question of how medical device product liability will change in the face of the challenges posed by digital health and AI. Well, in all honesty, of course, the safest thing to say would be that we actually can't make accurate predictions because we don't have enough case law. So the best thing to do would be to monitor a little bit the case law, the practice, before trying to make more solid predictions. And in general, after all, it is very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. However, I think I can propose some reasonable personal conclusions based on these very preliminary findings that I tried to describe during this presentation. So first, well, all the reports by the EU institutions, especially by the European Commission and all the working committees appointed by the European Commission, converge towards the same direction. That is, when the product liability will be revised, well, software will be likely considered as a product. The burden of proof of defect and causation will somehow be alleviated in favor of injured persons, in favor of claimants. And the scope of the development risk defense will likely be narrowed down, at least in some circumstances. And I think all these will greatly help victims of defective digital and AI-powered medical devices in product liability cases. At the same time, I think that, well, the strengthened monitoring and even cybersecurity obligations under the medical device regulation may favor the development of fault-based liability claims, targeting the manufacturers of digital and AI-powered medical devices. Okay, so thank you all for your attention, and if you have any questions, please let me know in the Q&A session. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Andrea, very much for the very clear presentation. Now I'm pleased to give the floor to Alessandro Blasimme from Zurich, who will give us a presentation about the governance problems of all these issues that we're talking about. Please.
Hello, I can't hear Alessandro. I don't know if it's my problem or...
No, Alessandro, we cannot hear you yet. I was thinking that you hadn't started yet. I don't know.
Oh, the micro is not on.
I
think it's better.
You have to unmute
right?
yourself. Okay, perfect. Here we go.
And can you see my slides?
Not anymore. Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Now
Okay, cool.
everything's
So, good afternoon, everybody, and buon pomeriggio to my fellow Italian citizens who are on this webinar. Thank you very much to the SoBigData project, to the Leader Lab at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and in particular to Giulia for the very kind invitation. As Giulia said, what I'm going to talk about is how the governance of digital health innovation intercept quite specific and also quite interesting ethical and policy issues. So let me show you the outline of this presentation. First of all, I would like to start with some general remark on the state of digital health innovation, and I would like to stress how it is currently accelerating. As an example of how we need to think about emerging governance issue, I would discuss the case of digital contact tracing systems that have been deployed in many countries around the world during the pandemics. And I will briefly mention some issues that relate to the use of artificial intelligence in medicine. And then I would like to illustrate in a very general form, due to time constraints, the our work on moving from principles to practices in good governance for digital health. So there are many actors who are trying to measure how fast different countries are embracing digital health innovation around the world. This is an initiative that was led by Roche. It is actually led by Roche at the moment. It's still ongoing, and I have to declare I'm part of this initiative. I contributed as an expert to this initiative, and basically the Personalized Health Index is a set of measurements, country-specific measurements that try to estimate the preparedness of different countries to embrace digital transformation of healthcare. This is the example of how it looks like. This is Italy. This is the European Personalized Health Index. There are a number of dimensions. We don't have time to get into the details, but basically they're trying to rank different countries across a variety of dimensions that are relevant to achieving innovation and impact in digital health in different countries. What is interesting about these kind of instruments is that they give you sort of quite robust indications as to what needs to be done, as to where the gaps are for a given country to reach certain benchmarks, and where we need to intervene with policy actions to reinforce the innovation trajectory in any given country. In general, in Europe, digital health innovation is proceeding at a good pace, although the situation is quite patchy in different countries. But what is interesting is that the recent crisis that we have been going through during the last year is actually accelerating a lot of the aspects that this kind of index tries to measure. I stumbled upon this interesting paper a few days ago explaining how also regulators are trying to capitalize on the acceleration of innovation in digital health during the COVID-19 crisis. In particular, the FDA is unrolling policies that support digital health innovation during the pandemic, but these policies have a temporary character. So even the regulatory grip is actually that the FDA is trying to implement is only temporary for the time being. At the same time, there is expanded access to personal data that entails more privacy-related risk. So the upshot of this paper is to suggest that we should expand our capacity to collect real-world evidence about digital health innovation, which is in line with current regulatory trends by the FDA, for example, but also it's in line with the enhanced post-marketing surveillance in the MDR that we just heard about. But what is interesting is that real-world evidence collection here should extend to users' experience. And the idea here is to actually implement what can be called an adaptive governance approach. So an approach that regularly tries to understand how a given technology is performing in the real world and to adjust the regulatory environment around it accordingly. I will say more on the adaptive governance approach later on. Of course, during the current crisis, and in particular during the last period in which we witnessed the emergence of more dangerous strains of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, there is an increase in interest in collecting and analyzing more data to actually map how the epidemic is actually spreading. And in this respect, especially the role of biobanks in Europe is starting to change. It's starting to embrace a more public health kind of mission that goes beyond the more traditional research purposes of biobanks, which is interesting, and it's telling of how much we are accelerating in this domain. We, in our lab, have conducted an empirical study on biobanks governance, precisely to try to understand whether the biobanking community is ready for to embrace this big data turn that we have been talking about also during this webinar so far. And what we found out is that most biobanks are trying to make efforts at being transparent about their governance. Hello? Can I go on? I see some noise in the background.
Yes,
so, but actually we noticed that...
sorry, Alessandro, just if everybody can deactivate and unmute themselves. And I remember you have about 10 minutes because then we have to go on.
Yes. Yeah. So 10 more minutes, of course. There is less attention that is being paid to accountability and oversight mechanisms, however. So this brings me to the next topic of the presentation, that is digital contact tracing. There has been a lot of debate about technological designs and issues about privacy by design or privacy by default, but there has been comparably less discussion in this domain about the policies that enabled digital contact tracing systems to be deployed. And under the aegis of the WHO, we are conducting research in this domain in collaboration with the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins. What we can say about the policy aspects is that this is work in progress. It's an empirical work that we are conducting. It's not published yet. We have analyzed how digital contact tracing is taking shape in Europe. By the way, only 2 of these systems that we have analyzed have been classified as class 1 medical devices. And we found out that there has been basically no discussion about the implications of medical device classification in this domain. What emerges from this analysis is that more attention is needed to monitoring and governance mechanisms that would enable adapting the current regulations to the way in which these technologies are evolving, because these technologies are not deployed and then just stay as they are at the moment of deployment. They evolve over time. And one example that you see here on the right is the emergence of these QR code-based check-ins in the NHS digital contact tracing app. It's definitely unclear what mechanisms are in place or whether there are mechanisms in place at all to regularly oversee and to adapt the governance of digital contact tracing, as we explain in this paper in Science magazine that came out in November. Our view of the governance aspects of digital health is that adaptive governance can actually help deal with existing uncertainties, build trust, and make the common good out of this technology more tangible for all. I have anticipated I would have said a few words about the use of artificial intelligence in medicine and its governance implications. I would just limit myself to the issue of explainability. So we know that a lot of people think that it's a problem for, especially for machine learning algorithms, that they are not transparent. We don't know why they do what they do. Actually, on the issue of explainability, there is a very interesting academic debate, and some regulatory demands come especially from data protection law. For example, the GDPR has some explicit demands regarding the explainability, at least in the case of purely automated decision making by artificial intelligence algorithms. But actually, what precisely the regulatory requirement might be around explainability is not clear, especially the policies and the regulations by agencies like the FDA or EMA are not clear at all, in my view, in this respect. So again, also in this, what we need to factor in order to address the issue of explainability is actually to be able to capture more input from actual users and ask them what explainability requirements they think artificial intelligence algorithms in medicine should have. We have discussed some of these issues in these couple of papers here for your reference. Now, if we are talking about big data and their use in the context of biomedical research and biomedical innovation, we are basically confronted with an expanding array of data sources that corresponds to an expansion of technological and analytical capabilities, but also an expansion of policies that are deployed to cope with the novelty of big data. And the other piece of the puzzle is the enlargement of the array of stakeholders that have a stake in the way in which big data is governed across research and clinical use. Our adaptive governance approach to this issue, basically, as I said, I can only be very brief here. I can only be very quick, unfortunately, but it's basically premised on a framework of 6 principles that basically should align the governance of big data, both in biomedical research and in biomedical innovation. This is the set of 6 principles that we have published about, and they are the object of numerous projects at our end. The acronym that they form is AFFIRM, and basically you can find more details in publications from our lab. What is important about this framework, I think, is that it's an adaptive governance model for big data health research and digital health that is intended to produce some substantive alignment across a variety of different stakeholders in digital health. It definitely promotes an adaptive approach to governance that, again, means basically monitoring how a given technology performs and whether it fulfills regulatory and societal expectations when it's deployed in the market, and to adapt governance instruments according to this regular collection of real-world evidence. This is a project in which we are trying to move from the theoretical understanding of these principles to a more practical set of policy recommendations, in this case for a governance roadmap for Switzerland in digital health innovation. I will not go into the details here, but the idea is that there is a lot of work to be done in order to move from principles to practice in the area of digital health governance. So, very last slide, my takeaway points for this presentation is that we have to realize that digital health is an evolving space, that it's evolving, also exceeding the capacity of governance actors to actually preempt the space of policy making around this evolution. Digital health governance is very much still in the making, meaning that no single regulatory instrument is comprehensive enough. We heard in the previous presentation by Dr. Parziale that also liability governance has this kind of problem. We need definitely to monitor how the technology develops and to adapt governance instruments accordingly. And most importantly, we need to create an aligned vision across different stakeholders on how to implement reasonable governance around a rapidly evolving set of technologies like digital health. So with that, I hope I have not eaten up too much time, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, for this insightful presentation. Now I take the chance to give the floor to Professor Comandè, who is the director of our leader lab at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. So I give him the floor for final thoughts and for final consideration in light of what has been said this afternoon. Please, Professor.
Thank you, Giulia. Let me first thank everybody, very quickly. We are running out of time, but we will be doing it. I'm trying to stop my video to avoid bandwidth problems. All right, good. Let me once again thank you and Eleftheria for organizing and managing this beautiful awareness panel. And let me start with the hand, an advertising, a commercial. I mean, as you saw from the first to the last presentations, law and the ethical embedded issues are somehow in the background in any regulatory position. And we have a devoted research project, a legality attentive data scientist, which is actually opening up position on that. But let me go directly to what I intended to tell you in the few minutes. I'm trying to catch up with the time so that we can have still some room for discussion. So in dealing with the medical devices, we are basically dealing also, at least, with the many promises of the black box medicine. And as you can see from the list, there is a long list of promises that the so-called black box medicine, so the medicine which is helped by artificial intelligence is promising. And we shouldn't forget that most of the most advanced already existing medical devices are strictly related to the deployment of some sort of algorithm, some sort of artificial intelligence. And that kind of devices, think about a surgical robot as a paradigmatic example, can help through AI to replace and optimize professional work, somehow to replicate it virtually at no cost at all. So it's very huge promises that go in with that respect. But as you know, the devil makes the pots and pans, but not always the leads. So if one of the elements is that AI can, and that's a good thing, replace and optimize part, at least, of the professional work, this might create problems. And I will be just very briefly touching upon two issues, two so-called biases, the automation and translation or translational biases. Well, what is it? Automation bias, you know it, is when someone is so accustomed to rely on results of automation that somehow we are not even able to perceive or know, so it's a matter also of built knowledge and skills, whether or not the automatic answer can be wrong. And that's a very well-known example in case of the robot-assisted or AI-assisted surgeries, for example. If you think about it, and how captive, for instance, many advanced institutions are from their robots. I mean, the Da Vinci, there is extensive literature on the Da Vinci robot. Basically, there is no way back because you cannot substitute that kind of surgery using remote-assisted surgeries with traditional ones because the equipment are not there anymore and the skills are not there anymore, with all the possible implications. Now, this is, as of course, also implication in terms of liability that will somehow push towards as well changing the perspective, but we don't have time to touch upon it. That's just a flag for future discussion on it. And automation bias is very well represented both in data science and in medical history as well, with the example of Stanislav Petrov. At that time, 1983, young colonel saved the world from apocalypse because he did not believe to the automatic response provided by the Soviet Union at that time, announcing a nuclear attack. So something rang a bell in him, saying, well, why Americans would start a war only launching 5 missiles instead of a number of them. And indeed, there was a glitch in the system that created this appearance. So automation biases can really lead to a lot of problems. Let me very quickly introduce, before discussing them, to what is, I think, much more important when we deal with medical devices and, broadly speaking, with AI-based medical tools. That is the translational or translation bias. In very simple terms, it's the undesirable effect of deploying an AI trained in one context and deployed in a context which is only apparently similar. Now, think about medicine. If you are deploying a medical tool, an assisted robotics in our original example, or any other kind of device in a medical setting, we might be thinking that that's the same whether you are in Bethesda Hospital or in a rural hospital. That's not actually the case because, and again, there is extensive literature on that. When you have an AI, for instance, which is embedded or not in a medical device, which is trained exclusively in high resource environment, there is a very high expectation that the very same device, the very same AI would perform worse in lower resource environment. For instance, just because, and there's, again, these are just examples, the patient population or the user population, end users, in this case, medical doctors, for instance, can be different, or even the available resources are different. So what is related to the use of that device, the kind of needles, for instance, or side drugs that can go along a specific kind of device or surgery may be different, and that create, once again, possible problems. Now, if you think more closely to medicine example, there are some procedures that works perfectly well when they're performed by experts with excellent skills and excellent support facilities. So when you move from high resource to lower resource environments, so where normally this kind of devices and technology are developed in a very high skill and high resource environments, when you deploy them in a different environment, then the scenario can change in a very dramatic way and actually leading to a lower quality of the care instead of an increasing on the quality of care. Yet, once again, if you think back to my example, the decline in quality can even be difficult to observe and correct. And as strange as it might sound, even liability rules may not very easily kick in. So once the standard in the procedure is to follow the advice of the AI, and the doctor is following the advice of the AI, although it is creating problems and maybe making mistakes that cost lives or health of patients, still it can be perceived as acting with the due standard of diligence. So it's a risk of a vicious circle in which we have a lowering of level of quality of healthcare which is provided, with a protection of this lowering that is paradoxically maintained and even helped by shielding these events from actual liability. That's a complex issue. We don't have the time to go through it, but that's, again, another flag for you. Let me give you a couple of very simple examples of what I'm saying to make it more clear and less abstract. So gallbladder cancer and cholecystitis are very different illnesses, of course, and they have both very optimal choices to be made and performed. But they, again, rely on different medical settings. And the fact that a tool is used in one or another medical setting can make a huge difference and have very large implications. So if you are performing, and sometimes the symptoms are very similar, and there is a laparoscopy that undergoing for a cholecystitis, and the surgeon realized there is a gallbladder cancer, has to make a choice, either to continue and try to remove the gallbladder cancer, assuming that even the consent has been already given in that direction. So we're not discussing about it. Or just stop the intervention and send to a higher level and more advanced institutions to actually do the gallbladder ablation. This is just because if the gallbladder cancer ablation is not performed with the required skills, might create serious damages. On the other way, delaying the removal can lower to a very high extent the chances of survival. So it's a tragic choice, as Guido Calabresi would put it. But once again, here, most probably the suggestion that would appear on screen would be based on the training of the device in high-level systems in which, at the same time, there are very high-skilled users of that specific medical device, and there are the facilities to take care in case something goes wrong. That's completely different if the same tool are for the democratization of medicine, for the lowering of the cost, and all the good reasons we saw before are deployed in a lower level institutions. Now, this can apply as well, not only to surgical operation, also to the use of drugs. And here, the references of drug is just to the fact that we have devices that advise on the use of them. And again, there are a number of biases go well beyond automation biases and translational biases when dealing with this kind of tools, because other kind of built-in, if you want, biases, structural are then and are possible. So what is the answer? The answer is very clear, and as I mentioned in my first remark, opening to leads to the legality attentive data scientist, it's basically up to us, jurists, to guarantee a trustworthy and human-centric AI in which all these differences can be somehow dealt with. In very short, basically, we have to build both the pants and the lids together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giovanni Comandè, for this insightful last talk of our seminars. So I think we can open up the Q&A session. So anybody who has a question, a doubt, a curiosity in respect to the topics that we have touched upon today can just go on and ask. I see that in the chat. I see that sorry?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Giulia.
I see that in the chat there is already a question related to applicable framework of clinical trials for digital and AI-based health mobile app solution. Exactly, this is, I think, really more related to what I addressed in my topics. This is exactly now a very problematic issue in the European Union, because the European Medicines Agency has set up this big data task force without, however, providing clear guidelines. So for now, I think that economic operators who are willing to engage in this kinds of trial operation should move from the two basic frameworks of clinical trial regulation and medical device regulation. And we hope that more specific guidance in respect to digital health apps will come soon in respect to applicable standards, in respect to these clinical trials data, which are more real world data, as the European Medicines Agency calls it. But for now, no available standards are there more precise. I don't know if anybody else of the panelists want to intervene on the topic, has integration. This is my view on the scene, on the current scene for this problem. And of course, the United States is moving a bit more quickly on that.
Thank you, Giulia. I have a quick, but probably not quick in the answer, question to Paul. I think, Paul, you gave a very nice and clear presentation, and I agree with your analysis that referring to the medical goal behind it helps clarifying the legal rules. But now I'm wondering, honestly, whether just referring to that medical aim, if you want, medical reasoning, still would rather bring us still to square number one, because if you look from the point of view of medical doctors, for instance, there's no clear definition of what is normality. And I've been listening to a lot of doctors and ethics committee struggling with defining what is normal and what is a medical reason, especially when those that want to somehow push forward for enhancement are just using the psychological impact of enhancement on the one end, and to the other side, those medical doctors stressing the fact that any kind of push towards even natural issues are enhancing reactions, and even talking that terms for vaccines. So I wonder whether you see in the legal rules some other more firm points to which we can cling on.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, great question. Yeah, of course, the concept of normality is ever changing. It shifts. I mean, if we think back to 20, 30 years ago, when IVF first arose, for people who had trouble conceiving naturally, most people did not think it was, really a medical treatment. They didn't perceive that as a medical problem, but just the fact of life. And now, and that could have been, IVF at the time could have fallen under one of the definitions of enhancement that we use now. Obviously, things change, and now that is perceived as an illness, and it's not conceived of as enhancement or anything like that. And the same with many other things. Yes, vaccines could fall under the definition of an enhancement or a treatment. My feeling is that the medical device framework being targeted at medical devices, i.e. those used mainly by doctors, was good until now, because it was only medical professionals who really had the access to devices of that risk nature and who would implant them into the body, that kind of thing. Going forward, though, we're seeing the rise of individuals like biohackers, and other kinds of entities that are not strictly medical, that will have access to risky devices and will have the means to implant them. So, I mean, personally, going forwards, I know the regulation is new, but in the far out long term, I think the way forward will be to focus mainly on the risk in general and not the intended purpose. So, yeah, that's what I think. I don't think this current approach is sustainable in the extreme long term. It doesn't seem possible to me. In the medium term, it probably is, if we have this system of making exceptions, which the regulation seeks to, permit. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Professor Quinn. I don't know if anybody else of the panelists want to add something on this more ethical issue also. I don't know whether there are other questions from the audience. Okay, if not, I'm really glad for today's event, for today's seminar. I thank again all the panelists, the audience, of course, for attending this seminar, and in particular also for the Leader Lab and for Eleftheria for the organizational support that was absolutely needed in order to make this event possible. So thank you very much and have a good day.
We look forward to the next one. Bye-bye.
Exactly. We are already planning a next awareness panel, so stay tuned. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.